Welcome back to Hour 2 here in the Darkness on the Edge of Town. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Along with me for the ride every week, Mr. Tim Dennis, talking about news of the weird and unusual, ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, the Bermuda Triangle, and beyond. Thank you for joining us. And remember, if you can't listen to an entire show, we do archive the shows. Hey, we're going to go to our next guest for the evening. But again, remember, go check out our website at darknessevents.com. I wanted, Tim, I was looking for something a little bit unique and different. And, all the other shows, they cover conspiracy theories and a lot of the strange stuff. And I came across this author. And first of all, I was intrigued because his first book is something I loved. When I was a teenager, man, I was a huge Beatles fan. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that always intrigued me was the whole Paul McCartney is dead little conflict that was going on for a long time in conspiracy. And our next guest actually wrote an entire book about it and has collected some of the most compelling evidence. And I want to have him on the show here to talk about that. But he's written a book called Take a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll's Myths, Legends, and Curses. So please welcome for his first time, and hopefully not his last, author R. Gary Patterson. Good evening, sir.
Hello?
Yeah, sorry about that.
I'm sorry. All of a sudden there was silence on the other end. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for coming in. Now, I want to start off on this. I know we want to talk about some of the more macabre and strange stories, but I want to talk about your book, The Walrus Was Paul, for a few minutes.
Okay.
Because this book truly intrigues me. This was something that I was excited to get a copy of, to start going through. Now, let me ask your belief. Now, do you believe that this is nothing more than just a fun little marketing ploy that was made up by the Beatles? Do you think that they were unwitting participants in this and had no clue what was going on, or do you think Paul McCartney's dead and we've got a doppelganger lookalike taking his spot?
Oh, wow. I think that if I went back to 1969 and had found the stuff that I had in the book, I'd probably think Paul was dead. But, basically when I wrote the book, it was originally the idea was that I first thought it was a lot of fans with just really overactive imagination making everything fit. So when I wrote it, I had sort of a section on clues in which it was, just a totally ridiculous, or number 2, guided looking, guided listening, and which you try to make things fit, and there's some sort of sense of thing that it goes in like that. But what really intrigued me was category 3, and that would be clues that were actually planted by the Beatles. And I really do believe the Beatles did plant a few of the clues for whatever reason we may never know. But I think that there was an attempt for them to make us think that Paul was dead. I really do.
Well, let's go back to 1969. Can you give us a clue? Start up with the story on this. How did this great Beatle debate kind of start up? And I was surprised reading the book that you were able to track back some of the quote-unquote clues all the way back to Yesterday and Today and Rubber Soul album.
Yeah, well, that a lot of the clues went even further back than that. But what you got to remember is that when the clues actually hit in 69, everybody went back because Abbey Road was the album cover with the famous procession across the street. And then everybody started to re-examine the White Album, and they examined Magical Mystery Tour and then Sgt. Pepper. So now we're back to 67. And it just seemed like a natural progression to go further back. And McCartney was always different in a lot of the photographs. He always had his back turned or profile, and people started taking that and they said, oh, look at the Help album. McCartney's the only one without a hat. So then it started to get really ridiculous as it was going back. But if we go back to 69, first of all, we'll have to set it up. If you remember, the Beatles did not perform live after 1966. Mm-hmm. No matter how much money was offered, they didn't perform live unless you count the rooftop, at Apple.
Right,
and,
for the Let It Be.
Let It Be. But, not any live performances. And basically, there was a lot of problems in their last tour. This was after John had made the statement that Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ, and someone threw firecrackers at him in Memphis. And there was, they thought was guns, and Lennon was, they told him that someone was going to shoot him at 9 o'clock at night, and that sort of terrified him because John had a major belief in the number 9 in numerology. So, and then when they had all their money and the problems taken away in the Philippines for the Marcus family, George turned to the other Beatles and said, it's not fun being a Beatle anymore. So they decided to go in the studio and change music as we know it, and that was another clue because this wasn't the Beatles after Revolver. When Sgt. Pepper's came out, the Beatles had mustaches, facial hair, orchestration. This wasn't I Want to Hold Your Hand, the Beatles. The music had changed, they'd changed, and everybody wanted to know, why weren't the Beatles playing live, and why has the music changed, and something's got to be wrong. And then the rumor came out that McCartney had been killed in a car crash.
Now, what year were they saying that he supposedly died? Were they saying he died in 69 or was it 66?
66 was the rumor. And so the thing really hit the airways with Russ Gibb. And a caller on a Sunday afternoon, whose name was Tom, called Russ, and he says, I want to rap with you about McCartney being dead and all that. And, of course, Gibb hadn't heard anything about it. He said, what do you mean about McCartney being dead? So he said, well, play Strawberry Fields Forever backwards. I mean, not backwards, but just play and listen to the end of it, and you'll hear John say, I buried Paul. So they started playing records on the air. The next thing you know, teenagers were coming down with their records to the studio, and they were playing all these songs. And then someone said, yeah, but play them backwards. Play Revolution Number 9 backwards. And then they could hear a car crash and a voice call, yelling, get me out, let me out. And so the next thing you know, you had a wave of hysteria. And then it was picked up by Roby Young in New York, and what was it, WABC, which I think reached about every state, from the East Coast to the Mississippi. And Roby Young said that he was let go because the program director told him that he was creating a national panic and to stop playing these records and stop talking about McCartney being dead. So it went everywhere. But it wasn't as big in England as it was here. And when the Beatles were told that there was a DJ in the United States who was saying Paul was dead and asked McCartney, what do we do? McCartney's answer was, well, sounds like good publicity to me. Tell him I'm not. But they didn't tell him until after November. So this went on for weeks, and, it was captivating. Now, there was no Internet. It was all done by radio. And it was sort of like, it was like everybody had a little piece of the clue, and there was almost a feeling of power that you knew something. And you got that, that strange feeling sitting in your dorm room or in your bedroom with your turntable trying to play it backwards and get those creepy feelings because no one had ever done that before. And, I know a lot of your listeners are younger, and they probably say, well, that's probably totally ridiculous. But you got to remember, the 60s, bad things happened. I mean, John Kennedy was assassinated in 63 and 68, Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy. It was all believable. I mean, there could have been some form of government conspiracy that felt that the Beatles and the counterculture was taking its toll. I mean, look at 1967. At Monterey, how many new artists died within 3 years who started at Monterey? I mean, you had Otis Redding, you had Janis Joplin, those two that just come to the top of my mind. I know that Mama Cass Elliot also was one of the originators who had a lot of friends in the counterculture, and she died. And Brian Jones, who brought Jimi Hendrix, and Jimi Hendrix himself, they both had died in 69 and 70. So, even though it was a terrible coincidence, it was just the idea that the counterculture was dropping like flies, and the Beatles had, actually gave the youth an idea against the Vietnam War and sort of challenged social mores. So, yeah, I mean, it was something that generation thought could be very well and possible. So a lot of people started looking for clues, and it actually became a great game, I guess, to find out who knew the most about Paul being dead and what were the clues.
Now, there were also some of the clues, and there were some of the clues that supposedly led you to phone numbers, and if you called the phone numbers, was there any were you able to do any backup where there was proof that people were answering the phone numbers and saying the Apple Records is evil or whatever the little thing was? And
yeah, I mean, we can talk about these because I think these things are fabulous.
Oh yeah, I'd love to go through them. We've got 2 hours to spend here together, and I think this is a great conspiracy story. So I'd love to know more.
And unfortunately, when I did the book in the '90s, it was kind of hard to actually get any of the phone numbers to still work. But what I did was track down, accounts of supposedly what had happened. Of course, that was part of the great fun of urban legends. But
right.
One of the things you're talking about is the Magical Mystery Tour album. And the story goes that if you turn the album upside down and you connected the large stars, a phone number appeared. And if you called the number, and some people even got more specific, Wednesday at 5 o'clock in the morning, Great Britain time, that you would have, there were 3 answers to the call. Some groups said that they heard a voice that was a funeral home. Well, that was spooky enough. And then a second voice, other people claimed who called the number, just heard a voice that just said, "You're getting closer." And then another voice appeared to ask the caller Beatle trivia questions with a promise to send it to Pepperland. And, I'd heard this thing about Pepperland. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the idea was the Beatles are going to buy this island and put on this great concert. And, I thought, well, this is a great myth. And then Alistair Taylor who was with Apple, I'd met him at a Beatle Fest. I think it was in New York. And he was talking about John Lennon came up to him and said, I want you to buy an island. And I thought, well, Pepperland, you know. And so maybe there was something there. Maybe this was a great game. But, you know, that was kind of interesting. That was the phone number. And but there were supposedly clues with mirrors, and the greatest mirror clues on Sgt. Pepper's.
So it was it November 9th, 1966, Paul McCartney had left after a fight at Apple Records and was supposedly killed in a car accident and decapitated. That's the story.
Well, the story is they left Abbey Road, and that it was on November 9th, 1966, and that was the rumor. So when I started doing the book, I thought, okay, we have this date, and, you know, I didn't think very much of it, but I thought, okay, maybe that's some evidence. So I went, researched all the London newspapers for the 2 to 3 weeks before and after. Really didn't find anything on that. And then I remembered the clue about the mirror on the Magical Mystery Tour album. So I noticed that if you look at the Sgt. Pepper's cover, I suppose this is probably the greatest clue of all, and this is the one I've never seen debunked. And, you know, no matter how you feel, this is one that was really ingenious. So it really says a lot about the Beatles putting it there. But, you know, maybe I really don't understand why they haven't confessed up to it. But personally, I hope they don't, because I think urban legends should live forever. But anyway, if you look at the Sgt. Pepper's cover, you'll remember that it looks like the Beatles. You see them in the wax figures from Madame Tussauds, and then you see the Beatles all dressed up in their psychedelic finery and their band outfits with all different colors. And the word Beatles in red hyacinth flowers appear to be on top of a freshly dug grave. And then there's a crowd of people standing behind the Beatles. And Life magazine actually devoted a cover to Paul Is Still With Us and went through the whole story. And they had this rumor that there was an open hand over Paul's head on the cover, and it was conveniently a Far Eastern symbol of death, or a hand of benediction when a person is buried, and the priest raises his hand and makes a sign of the cross. I mean, I thought, well, you know, at worst case scenario, there's an open hand over his head and not the other Beatles. But what was interesting was that the cover was designed by Peter Blake, who was a painter of Australian fairground posters, and I thought, well, that's cool. And Peter Blake was the artist, but the drumskin was the Australian painter, and his name was Joe Epgrave. And I thought, well, that's a funny name, Epgrave, Epthgrave. And obviously, I mean, maybe the name is Epgrave, but it sort of reminded me of an epitaph, which would be over a grave, and you'd find an epitaph on a tombstone. And if you look at the bass drum, if it is a grave, then the bass drum has to be the tombstone. And on a tombstone, it tells you the name of the person who died and the date of death. Now, there were two drum skins designed for the Sgt. Pepper's cover. They're both completely different, except for the phrase Lonely Hearts. So, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This is the reason the Beatles named the album, was to give this clue. And if you look in the crowd, you see Carl Jung. Of course, Carl Jung believed in mandalas as an archetype, so the drum fits the mandala of birth, death, and rebirth. And then you have Lewis Carroll, whose famous work was Alice's Adventures Through the Looking Glass. So that was a clue for a mirror. If you lay the album cover down or the CD and take a straight-edge mirror and place it in the center of Lonely Hearts, it spells out a cryptic message as you read from left to right. Actually, the L becomes Roman numeral 1, and then O-N-E, which is 1 again, and then you have I-X, which is numeral 9, and you have 119, and then it says he die. And between he and die is a diamond-shaped arrow that points straight up to Paul McCartney and down to the grave. And when I first found it, I thought, well, maybe it's one of the Beatles, the one with 9 letters, because McCartney had 9 letters. He dies. But what you got to remember is that on a tombstone, it has to be a date. So if you take the two ones together, it's 11-9, which would be November the 9th. Now, the first thing that I thought about would be that in Great Britain, it would be opposite. It would be September 11th, which is sort of another little chilling fact, you know, with our September 11th. Right. But there was no record of anything happening on September 11th. It was the Beatles were on holiday. But in two Beatles sources, there's a mention of a car accident that Paul McCartney may have had on November 9th, 1966 at 5 o'clock in the morning. So you get your calendar and you go back to 1966, and November 9th was a Wednesday. Now, when you turn the album cover over, the album cover appropriately is blood red on the back.
Right.
It was the first time in history that Beatle lyrics, or any lyric of any song, was printed on an album jacket. And if you look at the Beatles, Paul has his back to the camera. The other Beatles are looking straight forward, which means he's different. The rumor at that time was that the imposter had plastic surgery and the scars hadn't healed. Because, I love the way the conspiracy story fit. But George Harrison is pointing with his thumb, and that's what's interesting, because the picture was made and then the lyrics are superimposed on top of the picture. And what George is pointing to is the first line of the song, She's Leaving Home. And the first line says, Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock as the day begins, which was the exact hour and day of November 9th, 1966 that this was supposed to have happened. And, it's kind of interesting. And on the front cover, there's a doll sitting in a stuffed figure's lap, and the doll has a toy white Aston Martin model car on her leg, which was the car McCartney was driving in 66. And then the figure she's sitting in the lap, the figure has what appears to be a blood-stained driving glove on its left hand. So someone went to a lot of incredible trouble to hide something on that album cover. And whoever did the bass drum, it was brilliant. Now, when I researched it, I'd heard that it was Mal Evans, one of the Beatles' roadies, who came up with the phrase Lonely Hearts. And if that was the case, then, of course, Mal has now passed away for many years, but still the story is what a great hidden clue with a mirror on a drum skin. I don't know if anybody else could have pulled it off, but to me, that's the smoking gun of the whole thing.
Well, I thought I remembered in the book Shout, too, that came out in, I think it was early 80s. I thought there was a recollection of a nurse who supposedly called into a radio station on November 9th that morning saying that somebody had just been brought in a car accident, and they thought that it was Paul McCartney and that the patient had died. Well,
that's one thing that went through, and also, this is how I think the whole thing began. It was in January of 66, and a rumor had gone around that Paul McCartney had been killed on the M1 motorway outside London on the icy road conditions. So callers and newspapers were frantically calling Abbey Road and Apple trying to find out if this was true. They eventually found McCartney, who was at his St. John's Wood home, and when they got in touch with him, Paul said, no, I'm fine. I'm not left the house. Everything's fine. Don't worry. But, I was sort of wondering if he'd heard all that attention, why not say, hey, let's have some fun. Let's put some clues here. Because I know that John Lennon really had a good time putting lyrics in, I Am the Walrus, because everybody tried to analyze everything they did. So he said, let's see him figure this one out. That's when he did the Walrus. But the whole thing is, if it was a great hoax, then what they benefited is they sold a heck of a lot of albums in 1969. But the funny part was that nobody caught it. Not in 67 and 68. And when the Abbey Road album came out, that's when everything started to come about. But it's almost like they got impatient, because on the White Album you had Glass Onion, where John Lennon sings, I told you about the walrus and me, man. You know that we're as close as can be, man. Then he says, here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul. Now, he could have said, like Lennon in the Playboy interviews, the Fox Terrier was Paul, whatever. But it brings back that mystical black walrus symbol from Magical Mystery Tour, who is supposed to be a harbinger of death. So the idea of the walrus being Paul and mentioning another clue, which means that there were clues before. And so when they finally hit in 1969, that's the thing. Maybe they started throwing it out, nobody caught it, so they gave a few extra clues. But then also what's interesting is while they shut up about it, and that's also having to do with August of 1969 with the Manson murders in California, where Helter Skelter and other Beatle lyrics were written in blood on the wall of Sharon Tate's home that she was renting. And, that was a whole terrible story in which Charles Manson also heard hidden messages in Beatles songs.
Talking about a fascinating book called The Walrus Was Paul, The Great Beatle Death Clues. And our guest is R. Gary Patterson. The book is available online. We have a link for it at our site. Click them. They'll take you right over to Amazon so you can order your copies. Let me ask you, Mr. Patterson, again, doing the research on this book and the things that are going on. Now, I recall hearing when I was a teenager, one of the cool stories that I had handed down to me from somebody that I'd gotten in touch with back from the 60s had told me that one of the thoughts was that there was an Ottawa police man who had a striking resemblance to Paul McCartney and had won a contest back in the 60s. And suddenly, and he was also attached to a very prominent, wealthy family, much like the Eastman family, that, and suddenly Paul McCartney broke up with his longtime girlfriend, Jane Asher, and started dating Linda Eastman, and this new character kind of filled in for him and took over. And on the Sgt. Pepper's album cover, in the one scene, he's got the OPD, which is the Ottawa Police Department badge on his shoulder. Now, had you heard that, or do you have any relevance to that at all?
Well, actually, there are two names. The name you're talking about, supposedly in Canada, the imposter's name was William Campbell, okay? Mm-hmm. And the OPD badge on the Sgt. Pepper cover, of course, the British jargon for someone who's killed in a car accident and taken to the hospital is officially pronounced dead, so it's OPD. But if you really look at the patch, it's OPP, and it stands for Ontario Provincial Police.
That's not what it stands for nowadays, buddy. You down with OPP, Tim?
Yeah, you know me.
I know what you say.
I got it. But what was funny was, the thing is that when McCartney came out in Life magazine and they asked him, he said, well, perhaps it stood for the Ontario Police Department, which still meant OPD, which was all, I thought, well, surely it was OPP, But anyway, that was just, that was one thing. Another name was, Billy Shears. From Chelsea in England. There was a magazine even traced down the part of London. And then, of course, that clue goes in with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, where the line is, I don't really want to stop the show, but I think you might like to know the singer's going to sing a song. He wants you all to sing along. So let me introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears. And what does he sing? If I sing out of tune, would you stand up and walk out on me? Which was the idea that if they brought in an imposter because Paul was the cute Beatle, the most popular Beatle, then if he were gone and they brought in anyone else, would that person actually, create the excitement the Beatles did with McCartney? So that was the rumor with it. Now, what's real interesting, there was a Paul McCartney lookalike contest, and it was won by a Canadian singer whose name was Keith. Remember 98.6, or is that too far back? But he did resemble Paul McCartney. But,
okay.
The idea that, yes, there were Paul McCartney look-alike contests, whatever, but there was never been any claim to William Campbell or to Billy Shears, whose father's name was supposedly Philip Shears. I mean, it gets so just really interesting, all the rumor that spread around with it. But if you want to hear a real strange story, before Roby Young died, he was with a friend of his at the Village Voice who covered McCartney's engagement party in London. And he went over for Jane Asher and Paul's event. And he noticed that Paul was spending a heck of a lot more time with his photographer, Linda Eastman, than he was with Jane. So he goes over to one of the people at Apple and he says, this looks kind of odd. Why does Paul spend all the time with this female photographer and not with Jane Asher? And he said, the guy looked at him and he said, well, that's really not Paul, that's his double. And that's what Roby Young always swore to. So, the idea is that Apple could have had this thing set up. I mean, this was something that was just, it sold tons of albums. And one thing that, when you start researching a lot of rock bands, in 1967, Jim Morrison suggested to the Doors that they spread a rumor that he was dead so they could sell more albums. So, it's kind of funny. It all fits in with that. But what happened in 69, Abbey Road really wasn't doing that well, when it first came out. But when the rumors came out, everybody was buying the albums, playing them backwards, and then they bought the whole catalog. All these Beatle albums were jumping on Billboard. And Russ Gibbs said, at first, Apple was real angry with him. But then when the sales started coming through, this is funny. They sent him a gift, and they sent him his own collection of Beatle albums. Instead of sending him money, they sent him a vinyl copy of all the albums. Thanking him for the attention that was turned on to the Beatles that made them sell so many albums. So I thought that was pretty funny.
Now, was there any follow-up on these two gentlemen? Did either one of them ever go missing that supposedly were these lookalikes?
Oh, you talk about William Campbell. There's not even any information that he actually existed. Keith never went missing. He had a song called 98.6. I think he was a one-hit wonder. And actually, I have to date myself on this because I saw him perform with some of these other super bands of the 60s, like the Royal Guardsmen, who did Snoopy versus the Royal Guard.
The Red Baron, right?
And what was it? Oh, Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs and Tommy James and the Shondells. So it was the best of bubblegum pop for the 60s. But, of course, my first concert was the Rolling Stones, so that went so bad with Brian Jones and everybody. But my second one was that. So I remember seeing Keith, and come to think of it, I don't think he resembled Paul McCartney that much.
With all the hubbub of this then and all the stories going on, which is kind of interesting, too, that the stories continued through all of their album covers. You're able to track them pretty much all the way through. And Abbey Road, of course. The two I was really most learned on were the Sgt. Pepper and the Abbey Road album, which, had a bunch. But see, there was some of the stuff like the skull on the back I never saw. Again, matrixing of light, and the 3 on the board I never saw. The crack in the Beatles. I don't know. It just seems silly to me, a lot of that stuff. I thought the more interesting deal on the front was the whole look of, John Lennon dressed in white, almost like to me, it always looked like he was the priest. You had the pallbearer or the gravedigger next. Then you had Paul McCartney walking out of step barefoot, like most people are buried without their shoes on. And then you had Ringo kind of, following up the end. So that, to me, always looked a lot weirder than the rest of the stuff, I thought, which was kind of convoluted. But then it started going back and forth in the lyrics of the songs that led all the way through it. What do you think were some of the more compelling, weird lyric tips and clues that they gave out?
Well, I think some of the things that were a lot of fun were probably the backward tracks, because, a lot of people ask me, are there backward tracks in records? And they expect me to say no, I think. But, yes, there are backward tracks, but the subliminal messages that a lot of people got into in the 80s, which are phonetic reversals, are completely different, because the very first song that had a backward track was Rain by the Beatles, and somehow the tape was twisted over, and John went home to listen to it, and he heard the voice that was backwards, and he told George Martin, he said, put this on the song. So on the third verse you hear, it sounds like John is chanting maybe something in Hare Krishna or whatever, but when you play it backwards, all he says is, when the rain comes, they run and hide their heads. So on the White Album with Revolution number 9, where they cut slips of tape and spliced them together and held pencils on capstans on the tape decks and slowing the tape down, speeding it up, and flipping it backwards, and you hear a voice that sounds like John Lennon say, so all right, Paul, then we better go and see a surgeon. Then you hear the car crash, and then you hear the voice screaming, let me out, and flames burning inside the car. And then number 9 turns into Turn Me On Dead Man. I mean, that's pretty spooky, but sometimes when you listen to that, you sort of wonder, well, is this someone heard, and now I hear it because it's just, my desire to hear it. But I think that's pretty odd. Also, right before Blackbird on the White Album, there's some muttering, and when I researched it, Abbey Road said that John was saying, Monsieur, Monsieur, how about another one? But actually, when you listen to it, it sounds exactly like Paul is dead now. Miss him, miss him, miss him. And someone had some fun putting some lyrics in. And the clue, the walrus, was Paul. That's another one. At the end of I Am the Walrus, there's some lines that John supposedly just turned on the radio and got some Shakespearean actors doing a scene from King Lear. But you can hear a voice that says, bury my body. Then the next voice goes, oh, untimely death.
Right.
And then at the end it says, what, is he dead? And it just seems like it's real convenient that it ends with that. So you have some of that that's kind of interesting.
Well, did it seem strange to you, too, as you're researching this, that there seemed to be this great friendship between Paul McCartney and John Lennon that all of a sudden just went south? And I know a lot of people want to blame Yoko, but there was like an overnight change between the band and the two main characters of McCartney and Lennon. Do you think that's what really helped to perpetuate the mythos of this, is that it just really seemed to be no longer the two kids we grew up with?
Well, I think that, sometimes what we do is we like to keep things the way they are, and, selfishly within ourselves. And I think that in the beginning, when John was with Cynthia, and I don't think Cynthia was, Cynthia, I've known Cynthia for a while, and she's a very sweet person, and she's, just excellent person to be with. I mean, I think the world of her. But, I mean, as far as a creative equal to John Lennon, that's Yoko Ono, very avant-garde. And when he met Yoko and she came into his life, there was very little time for him to be with Paul. If you remember in the movie Let It Be, George Harrison's working on I, Me, Mine, And instead of helping him, John's waltzing with Yoko in the studio. So he just put all his time into Yoko, and he felt like Paul didn't understand that, they had grown up and grown apart. So I think that's one of the sad things. And I think that one of the things about a lot of people who blame Yoko is that if it wasn't for Yoko, I don't think there would have been a White Album. I don't think there would have been an Abbey Road, because John was ready to leave the Beatles, and he was furious with McCartney when McCartney came out with a solo album and announced that he had left the Beatles. So there was a lot of tension building there, and I think it's, from great creative people. And here's another thing, too, when we talk about Paul being dead. If Paul had died in 1966, what were his greatest songs to 1966? I mean, Yesterday, okay? And, Eleanor Rigby, those are great, but think of the songs that McCartney wrote after 1967. The whole second side of Abbey Road, Live and Let Die. I mean, the guy who took his place, if he looked like him, he had to be a heck of a talent, didn't he?
Although you got to give him this, that if anybody was going to try to make a show for Paul McCartney being dead, it would have to be after he left the Beatles, because then you get stuck with songs like Silly Love Songs and
I think if you play
Happy Christmas
on backwards, it actually says, I really wish I was dead.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd like to just know, what is your thoughts with all these amazing amount of clues? Did you think that they thought, eventually this thing is going to start to run out of steam, so we'll put all the stuff into effect, so later on, because what it totally reminds me of is that 3 Men and a Baby movie that came out, and amazingly, just as it came out on video, they happened to notice the ghost of this little boy in the window, and suddenly videotapes started selling and being rented like mad just in time for this movie to break. And it became like one of the best-selling movies of that year.
Oh, it did.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree that all the Beatle albums started selling greatly after that, and, they probably still do. After we do a show like this, you'll probably have a lot of people want to go out and buy the albums and look and listen again, because, it's a great experience. It's a lot of fun. And especially if you have a bunch of kids like in high school when they get into it.
Right, which is what I was, right.
Oh, yeah. Even today, it's amazing how many young kids are into this and the Paul is dead thing. And every now and then there's rumors. I know that I was doing another radio show, and I had to, there was a site that had photographs of Paul McCartney that were shot from 66 in the early 60s. And then those features were placed on McCartney after 67, and the features didn't match.
Right.
So the idea was, oh my gosh, look, here it is. But then I had to go into actually the TBI, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and talking to people about photographs. And then, there were certain things about how the photos were stretched in the album covers, and how a lot of these were basically not placed together scientifically. And so it was all just
well, that and the fact that we know as we get older, our noses and our ears continue to grow.
They do, and
so things are going to shift.
Like McCartney being taller, but it was in the same day they have a picture where you didn't see if Jane Asher had her shoes or if she was kneeling, and it was pretty bad. But the worst part was that they were saying, well, look how the faces meet with Tara Brown, who was the guy who was killed in the car crash in Day in the Life. Maybe Tara Brown was Paul McCartney, or oh my gosh, Doris Day doesn't match. Look at her face. And I was thinking, it was better if it was not inclusive. It has to be something that was only once like that. So that became sort of a little a buzz, I guess, about 5 years ago. I remember that.
Well, now I'm curious too with the weirdness. It actually went over in the albums after the Beatles broke up. John Lennon and Paul McCartney, I don't know if a lot of people know this, had this little verbal assault going on their albums.
Oh, yeah.
Where they would write a song in response to each other's songs. And I know in one of the songs, John Lennon says something about they were right when they said you were dead.
Yeah, that was how can you sleep? And it says those freaks was right when they said you were dead. But Ringo had one too. And the story goes that the other three Beatles resented McCartney because McCartney went with Eastman and on the business end, and that was one of the reasons they fell out. But they had a code name for McCartney that was Boogaloo, and there's a song called Back Off Boogaloo, and there's a line where Ringo says, "Wake up, meathead, don't forget that you were dead." And so, yeah, they continue with that. But here's the fun part. I think it was in 97, maybe 96, The Simpsons show had an episode where Lisa wanted to become a vegetarian. So on the show, she meets Paul and Linda.
Right.
And Paul's telling her, he says, if you play Maybe I'm Amazed backwards, there's a ripping recipe for lentil soup. So when the show ends, sure enough, it ends with Maybe I'm Amazed. But on this version, you can hear a voice go, blip, 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 blip. I said, oh, my gosh, it's a backward track. So when you reverse it, you hear Paul McCartney say, take 1 cup of pepper, add 1 teaspoon. He goes through a whole recipe for lentil soup. And then at the end, he says, oh, by the way, I'm alive at the end of it. And that was in 97.
Very cool. Well, did they ever come out, and agree to, yeah, we threw some of these on just to screw with you guys. Did they ever address that, or did they just, I don't know, you guys are crazy?
Well, it seems like we have this great revisionist history, because in 69, when Life magazine came out with the clues, Paul said, that was John in black on the Magical Mystery Tour album. He was the walrus suit. And then in 1980, in an interview in Chicago, I've got a clip from Paul McCartney saying, well, we were filming the Magical Mystery Tour, and I just picked up this walrus head and put it on. So, yeah, I was the walrus. Well, how can it change from 69 to 80? Who was in the black walrus outfit? I thought that was funny.
Well, didn't they all think it was John anyway, because the walrus has got little glasses on the end of his nose?
That's what you'd think.
Right.
And the other thing is that as this was going on, I have a friend who was with ABC Radio. And when the anthologies came out on ABC, he got an interview with McCartney, and he's a good friend of mine. We did a lot of radio, and he, major Beatle fan. So he interviewed McCartney, and he asked him, he said, on Free as a Bird, when they put it out, there's over 90 hidden Beatle references in the video. You knew that, right?
I did not.
Okay. For your listeners, if they're really, really strong in their Beatle lore, take the video, Free as a Bird, and watch, and there's references to Beatles songs all in there. It's amazing what they do. And
everybody's checking out YouTube right now, I bet.
That's it. Well, that's fun. Right. This is what makes this, just fascinating. So McCartney in the interview, when he asked him that, he said it became a bit of a game in the old Beatle days to put little hidden things in. And that's what McCartney said. And so as soon as this was over, my friend calls me and he says, listen to this, and he plays the tape. He says the first time he ever said the Beatles put anything in hidden. And so maybe that was something, but a bit of a game in the old Beatle days. Well, it was a heck of a game, and, I'd like to know how many clues I missed. That's the fun part.
Well, again, the name of the book is The Walrus Was Paul, The Great Beatle Death Clues. It's written by R. Gary Patterson. You can get the book at Amazon.com. There's links for it right on our website, so check it out. And it's a fascinating book. We only scratched the surface, people. I'm telling you, this book is a fascinating read. I handed it, when I got the copies the other day, I handed this book to my daughter, who's 12 years old and a voracious reader, and she loves the Monkees. And I said, honey, if you love the Monkees, this is a really cool deal Dad was into at your age about the Beatles. And I said, why don't you read this? And I'll tell you, she read this book in a day and a half.
Oh, that's great.
And loved it. And she's 13 years old, so, out of her element with who this all is. But she said, Dad, this is fascinating. She goes, this is just a great read. It's like a murder mystery.
And it is. And I think that's what's fun. I think that's why the story lives forever, because a new generation is going to come up. They're going to hear the urban legend. It's going to keep going.
That's right. When we come back, we're going to be talking about your other book, Take a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll Myths, Legends, and Curses. And one of the things I want to point out about one of the clues from the McCartney death that's on the Abbey Road album cover, and something that you kind of cover in this book as well. We're going to come back with more, so stay tuned. We got a lot of crazy stuff to talk about. Rock and Roll's Myths, Legends, and Curses with author R. Gary Patterson. You're listening to The Darkness on the Edge of Town Paranormal Radio Show.
Beyond the Darkness.
Tonight we're talking about strangeness in the rock and roll world. I know that's hard to believe, Tim. Strangeness in rock and roll.
Never. Between the drugs, the groupies, and satanic worship.
There's also myths, legends, and curses, and that's what we're talking about tonight with author R. Gary Patterson. Take a Walk on the Dark Side is his other book that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. The Walrus Was Paul. An interesting read. That was what we spent our first hour talking about. We're going to go back and speak to our guest now, and I want to thank you. The first hour was interesting. Like I said, I really love the whole mythology of the Paul McCartney death. And I wanted to mention with the whole backmasking thing, Mr. Patterson, one of the things I always thought was really interesting too was and I'm sure you probably already know this, but our listeners may not. When the Double Fantasy album came out, right, which was just prior to John Lennon's assassination, are you aware of the backmasking that took place on that album? Actually, I don't even think it was backmasking, right? It's Yoko speaking in between a few of the songs. Are you familiar with this story as well?
We Killed John Lennon?
Yes, and I think she said, I shot John Lennon in one part, right?
Oh, I think it's We Killed John Lennon, which was a part. I think that, when I talk about backward masking.
Now, that was that backward masking where it's the tape played back, or was that just her between the tracks mumbling?
It's more like a phonetic reversal.
Okay.
And those are the ones where the voices sort of spin a little bit and they're not very clear. I guess the best one to describe that with would be Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin on the third verse. That's a classic example of what would be referred to as a phonetic reversal, which means that you have to actually say the line, like in this case, We Killed John Lennon, then you would play it backwards, and then you would have to construct some phononyms that would say that when it's reversed. In other words, with Zeppelin, if you do the line, if there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alarmed now. Now, I've never understood what a bustle in a hedgerow is, but, when it's supposedly played backwards, it's supposed to give this great dark message, and I think that's what it is. So maybe your listeners probably are familiar with the Led Zeppelin backmask.
All right, good deal. Yeah, now, something else I wanted to talk about, too, is one of the main clues on the album cover of Abbey Road is a little Volkswagen Beetle, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And its license plate is 28 if, which supposedly means that had he survived, at that time he would have been 28 years old, correct?
Right, except he was only 27. And
which ties us into this new book.
Doesn't it?
Right. See how I did that? It's almost like I'm a professional.
You're good.
Yeah.
And, of course, you couldn't, if you had that reference, the people who were caught and they were saying, well, he really wasn't 28, they would say, yes, but he was in his 28th year of life. And in Far Eastern religions, they include the time you're in your mother's womb as your birthday. So everybody made things fit. And I enjoyed, a lot of the great clues, the ones that make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. I never will forget when I first heard them or I first saw them. And it's just great that, a whole new generation or people not familiar with it can re-experience it, because I guarantee you won't listen to Beatles songs the same way again.
That's right. You go back through. So now let's talk about the 27 Club here. And it is interesting that here you've come up with this kind of mythos yourself with the 27 Club, and this actually kind of fits for Paul McCartney as well, if he truly did die during that time.
Well, when I was researching my second book, which was Hellhounds on Their Trail, and I did it with a small publisher, and, sometimes if you're with a small publisher, when you put a book out, it becomes popular. They can't keep up with the demand for it. So I had some problems getting the book into the distribution in numbers, so I bought the rights to the book back, which is, kind of unusual. And then I sold them to my publisher at Simon & Schuster. I put the book out again the way I originally wanted done, as, Take a Walk on the Dark Side, and expanded. I mean, I think it's much more superior book. But what I did is, not even thinking about it, I made Hellhounds on Their Trail into a cult classic where people were spending up to $200 a copy trying to get the book, from book dealers. And I thought that was bad. So if you have a chance, get the Take a Walk on the Dark Side for anywhere between $14 and $15. It's much better copy with photos and everything. But just amazing how that happened. But one of the things I researched was I was doing the whole thing based on Robert Johnson, and of course your listeners may know that Robert Johnson was the great blues player who had the rumor that he had sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads. And I noticed he died at 27. And then it sort of struck me as being odd that Brian Jones died at 27, and Janis Joplin died at 27, and Jimi Hendrix died at 27, and Jim Morrison died at 27, Kurt Cobain died at 27. I could go through a list of these. And so I thought, well, it's kind of odd that some of the greatest rock icons of our time died at the same age as Robert Johnson, who Eric Clapton said was the founding father of the rock and roll sound with his technique on the guitar. So that sort of set me up into what I called the Curse of 27, or the Club, or the 27 Club, because I remember Kurt Cobain's mother saying, now he's gone and joined that stupid club. I told him not to join that stupid club. And I thought, wow, the Club, what a great title for a chapter. And that's what I did. And, I could have said, yeah, isn't it tragic how many rock stars died before they were 30? Okay, which would be a great list.
Right.
And, of course, the lifestyle plays a lot into that. But what I did, I was very particular. You had to be 27. It didn't include Graham Parsons, who was 26 and just a few months short of being 27, or Otis Redding or some of the others who just passed it. You had to be 27 at the time. And there's over 40 rock stars who died at the age of 27. And just last week, I got an email. And if your listeners would like to write me, get me at www.rgarypatterson.com. And if you have anything you'd like to ask me, I'd be glad to send you an email. But I got an email from a fellow who's getting his PhD in statistics, and he said, I just want you to know that I did a database of all rock stars' deaths, and 2-to-1 rock stars at the age of 27. That was the most frequent death from Buddy Holly all the way up, and they didn't even go back to the blues. So, I guess there's something odd. Now, what you may want to know, why 27?
Yeah, why 27?
And, one of the things you think about is numerology. And 2 plus 7 is 9. And 9 is the only single digit multiplied by another single digit that will always equal 9. 3 9s are 27, 2 plus 7 is 9. 9 times 9 is 81, 8 plus 1 is 9. And no other number will do that. So 9 is considered to be the highest spiritual power. So if you're Jimi Hendrix or Jim Morrison at the Doors, when they died at 27, they were at their peak.
Right.
As far as their artistic ability. And also, I think in astrology they say that you go through the first cycle of life is 27 years, and they go through this, and, it's kind of amazing that it fits in. Or even numerologists will go with 2 and 7. Like I think a 2 is a person who seeks love and affection, and 7 is a person who maybe lives a lifestyle which may not be too exactly conducive to a long life. I mean, I know rock and roll stars, they get everything they need at an early age. Of course, they travel rather recklessly trying to get from show to show. There's the drugs and a number of other things. But still, it's probably a great hazard. I remember reading an article with John Mayer, and they asked him, they said, well, what do you consider one of your greatest accomplishments? And he said, well, I'm past 27. And I thought, wow, So obviously it's taken on a major impact now than when I first brought it out with Hellhounds on Their Trail and Take a Walk on the Dark Side. But I think if I was a rock star and I hit 27, I think I'd stay home. I think I wouldn't fly in small planes, and I would not play my electric guitar in a bathtub.
Well, yeah, I don't know any musician in the world that should be taking little planes anywhere, because that just wrought with peril. Tim's putting on his headphones. He's ready to chime in.
Yeah.
Britney Spears. No,
Britney Spears. Are you trying to book a flight for Britney and Christina? So with this club, now you said that there's over 40. Again, give us a couple more of the names besides Kurt Cobain and Janis Joplin.
Okay, well, Robert Johnson was, a great blues legend who died at 27. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, mysterious death, died at 27. Jimi Hendrix died at 27. When Janis Joplin heard that Hendrix died, she said, well, I'm sure glad I didn't die today. He'd get all the press. She died 2 weeks later.
Wow.
And then the next year, well, actually several months, Jim Morrison was at his trial in Miami, and he had heard that both Joplin and Hendrix had died, and he turned to the friends at his table and he said, well, you're drinking with number 3. And he was dead in July of 1971. Pigpen from the Grateful Dead died at 27. Blind Al Wilson from Canned Heat died at 27. Pete Ham from Badfinger died at 27. Chris Bell from Big Star died at 27. Kurt Cobain died at 27. Kristen Pfaff from Hole died at 27. Jason Thirst from Pennywise died at 27. Brad Newell from Sublime died at 27.
Wow.
And the list goes on and on and on. I mean, what I normally do is I usually talk about some of the larger names that most people know, and just what would be the odds that these artists died at that one age, not under 30, but at the age of 27. It's pretty fascinating to find out how many actually passed away at that time.
Do you think with the younger generation that they know about the 27 Club now, and maybe some of them that are kind of hell-bent on self-destruction anyways, maybe are adding or wanting to add to that myth or go for the mythological number if they think their number is going to be up anyways?
You know, I hate to say this, but I think there's some truth to that. I know that it's kind of nice in a way that you contribute something, to folklore with the 27 thing. But I've noticed now there's a group called the 27s, and it seems like that's something in there. I think that, Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton both never thought they would live to see 30. They told friends they never thought they'd be 30. Ronnie Van Zant and Leonard Skinner had told his family that, he would never see 30, and he was right. He died before 30 in a plane crash. But, just the idea that rock and roll is such a compelling art that you die young. It's kind of like Alexander the Great in Greek mythology. According to the story, he said that Zeus Ammon appeared in front of him and gave him two choices. He could have the long life but never know fame, or he could take the short life and know glory. And he chose the short life. And the one thing about it, these rock stars who died 27, they're still the most compelling artists that everybody says, well, what could they have done if they'd only lived a little longer? But they're still frozen in time at that age where their music was at their best. So sadly, I'd say there are probably a lot of young rock stars who would say, that's probably the way to go out. Because what is it? Better to burn out than fade away, And I think that's it.
Tonight, though, we're talking about Take a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll's Myths, Legends, and Curses with author R. Gary Patterson. And we're talking about the Strange 27 Club, where it seems that as soon as somebody of musical, angst hits that age of 27, they've been passing away at crazy amounts of low or high numbers at a crazy low age. I got to guess that as you're doing this research, when you started doing this, did you realize how many people had passed away at the age of 27?
Was really interested in the deaths of Brian Jones, Janis Joplin, and Jimi Hendrix because they were all conspiracy theories behind it. I thought, well, I'll check this out. And then after I did the chapter on Johnson, I noticed he died at 27, and then 27, and then 27, and then 27. I remember Kurt Cobain, 27. I thought, well, maybe I should just research this and see how many rock stars died at the age of 27. And then I was just stunned because I couldn't find another age. And then when I got the email where someone had actually taken the time to actually do the statistical breakdown of it, it was even more. Over 40. And, this list starts at 17. Rock stars who died at the age of 17, which actually was Richie Valens in the plane crash with Buddy Holly. But, it's just really amazing. So, I don't know if it's a curse or just a run of bad luck, but I guarantee you that rock stars today, when they hit 27, I think they're pretty well familiar with what happens at that age.
Let's talk about some of the other strange facts that you've collected in the book. Now, first of all, talk to me about the Jimmy Page Zeppelin curse. This is something I'm not familiar with.
Well, Jimmy Page always was, he always had a fascination with the occult, and especially Aleister Crowley. He had a bookstore called the Equinox in London in which he would sell Crowley memorabilia, and he collected a great deal of Crowley memorabilia. He had annotated books, he had the robes, he had ceremonial daggers, and then one day, Crowley's home, Boleskine House, came up on the market. Now, the house had a dark history, and this is a great radio show to talk about this because Boleskine House was built in the medieval period on the spot where a medieval church was burned to the ground with its entire congregation trapped inside. Later, a man was beheaded in the house, and guests claimed that they hear the head roll down the stairs at night. So Jimmy Page was fascinated. And the house had even a larger dark history. The people who had moved in, a number of them had been driven into madness, into suicide. There were murders committed in the house. One man tried to kill his family. They locked themselves in a closet to escape him. Another man took a meat cleaver, cut his hand off as he was rotting I don't think he found that on the grocery list he was making, but cut his hand off with a meat cleaver. Aleister Crowley's wife was driven into madness. His little girl died as he lived in the house. The story goes that there were certain rooms that were so dark with his summoning of elemental spirits that artificial light would not even light it up. And when Kenneth Anger, the film director who was involved with Jimmy Page doing the film score for Lucifer Rising, he stayed in the house, and he claimed that a huge painting that must have weighed a couple of 100 pounds actually floated off the wall and set quietly on the floor. The other rumor was that Jimmy Page never spent the night in the house. His groundskeeper did, and he was, I was doing a series with VH1. It was called VH1 Confidential, and we did an interview with him, and he was talking about trying to sleep and hearing the scratching sound on his door, and then a knocking that reverberated all through it. And he said, frankly, I was terrified. Well, that would be pretty simple there, to say that. But if you see the movie, the song remains the same. When Jimmy Page is climbing up the mountain to the old man of the tarot cards, the hermit, you can see Boleskine House in the background. But after that film was made, a number of terrible things happened. Now, some people believe that Kenneth Anger had publicly placed a curse on Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin because Page hadn't produced enough music for his film score. But Jimmy Page laughed that off. But what happened was that a number of tours were broken. It was just terrible bad luck. John Paul Jones had broken his little finger, I think, on his left hand, so they had to cancel a tour. John Bonham had a number of car accidents that kept a tour from happening. The strangest was with Robert Plant. He and his wife, Maureen, were injured on vacation in a terrible car accident. She almost died. And I think it was when they were making the Presence album that Robert Plant had to do the album sitting in a wheelchair. And eventually in 77, they went on tour again, and while they were in New Orleans, word came that Robert Plant's son, Carrick, had died of a very simple disorder. It was like a stomach virus and complications that went in. So as soon as all this bad luck happened, and also the death of Bonham in the 80s, the British newspapers really took it out on Jimmy Page, claiming it was his interest in the occult that brought the Zeppelin curse and all these terrible things that happened. And, of course, there were rumors that Plant wouldn't play with Page because of that it cost too much. And then you go back to the beginning. I mean, here was a group, 2 studio guys. Jimmy Page was probably the most brilliant sessions guitar player in British rock. I mean, he's the guy playing guitar on Sunshine Superman by Donovan.
Oh, really?
He plays guitar on Hurdy Gurdy Man. He plays Baby Please Don't Go for Van Morrison and Dim. I mean, brilliant guitar parts, but nobody knew who he was. And then John Paul Jones was an arranger, producer, sessions player, so he plays bass. And then you get this 18-year-old kid, Robert Plant, and 18-year-old drummer John Bonham, who no one had heard of. And these guys knocked the Beatles off the charts. Nobody had heard of them. It wasn't the Stones. So the rumor went around that they had signed a pact, just like Robert Johnson, and that one of the members hadn't signed, but the other 3 did. And it was whispered about it. The road crew whispered about it. And they knew that Page was interested in Crowley memorabilia. And they also know that when Led Zeppelin 4, the So-So album with the 4 cymbals, was recorded at Headley Grange. Headley Grange was an old Victorian house that used to be a workhouse. And, of course, workhouses in the Victorian period was where the working poor were forced to go in and work for their sustenance. And it was a house that was filled with misery and suffering. And when Page went into the house, he claimed that he saw apparitions at the top of the stairs, that his sheets were always wet. And that was where Stairway to Heaven was recorded with some of the others. So it was actually, as Page referred to it, as being a hot spot, I guess you would say, as far as hauntings go. So that album was recorded there, which is probably their greatest album, Led Zeppelin 4. So the curse, the Boleskine House story, I mean, Boleskine House for you guys, I mean, you'd love this because this is probably the greatest haunted house in rock and roll history is Boleskine. And
well, let's get real quick. My co-host Tim has a question. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, just to add to the whole Jimmy Page legend of him being obsessed with things dark, didn't he supposedly write a lot of the music by doing some sort of form of automatic writing? Have you heard that? Either he or Page did lyrics or music by doing automatic writing?
Well, Plant, I'd heard, had done this. Automatic writing was used. And, of course, Plant had this great love of Tolkien. And when they did Stairway to Heaven, and it has the famous backward track on the 3rd verse that supposedly if you play it backwards, you hear a voice that says, "Here's to my sweet Satan." And then the next line, very clearly to me, says, "The one will be the sad one who makes me sad, whose power is in Satan." And, Crowley had a book called Theory of Practice, or what is it, Theory of Practicing Magic. And in the book, it says, Crowley says, the magician must learn to think backwards, to walk backwards, to listen to his phonograph records backwards. So you do have a line that goes in there with that. Of course, Plant says that the words just came to him, but they didn't try to do anything. It would be something subliminal. But, I have heard something about that the words just came, which would be like automatic writing, which you're talking about.
Well, I don't want to, I just thought I'd throw this out there, too. If you listen to Mandy by Barry Manilow backwards, he clearly says, listen to Darkness Radio. I didn't know if you knew about that, Gary.
No, I didn't, but I'll put it in my next book. How's
That's
that?
right. And Copacabana, play it backwards, and Barry Manilow's heard saying, I'm totally rubbing my nipples right now.
Yeah.
It's a strange story. And we actually, I've got a call on the line here with us. So if you don't mind, we'll take a quick question from the audience. Is that all right, Gary? All right. And Robert, we have you on the line. You have a question?
Hey, Dave, how are you?
Doing good, buddy. Thanks a lot for calling in tonight. What was your question for our author friend here?
Well, besides the whole Robert Johnson Legend of the Crossroads deal, do you think there could have been another situation that could have possibly triggered all of these myths and rumors in the music world?
Okay, you're talking about the Crossroads being the beginning of it?
Crossroads thing, devil at the crossroads kind of deal. Do you think there could have been like something else that might have started the rumors? Or
I think that's a good question. I think that what we have to look at is where rock and roll came from, which is the very rural South. And I think you'd have to remember that a lot of blues artists played the juke joints on Friday and Saturday night and then went to church on Sundays trying to ask forgiveness for what they did on Friday and Saturday night.
Right.
So they were sort of torn between what was good and what was evil, because in those days, and basically, I guess we still say this in the South, but, you know, when you go to churches a lot, and probably the more conservative churches say there's only one type of music. You either serve God or you serve the devil. And I know that Little Richard mentioned that when he went into the ministry. So you take that idea and you throw in sort of the belief system. Now, when you take a look at the Crossroads thing, before you do anything about music, if you do anything with Robert Johnson, Crossroads were always considered to be places where people who were executed as criminals were buried because they wouldn't be buried in hallowed ground. And the story goes that witches met at Crossroads. So if you've read the story Young Goodman Brown, written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, 19th century, Young Goodman Brown meets the devil at the Crossroads. All right, this is many years before Robert Johnson. And in voodoo religions and African religions, there's a god who guards the crossroads between the living and dead, and his name is Legba. So the story goes that for black Africans, the story of the blues, the story of fighting for your mortal soul on Sunday for what you did on Friday and Saturday night, and the legend that a blues player could wait at that crossroads, a black man would appear, a big black man, and you would not look at him because you'd be terrified, but you'd hand your guitar over your shoulder, and you'd listen as he tuned it to a special tuning, and when he handed it back and you accepted it, you'd made your deal. And the deal would be that you'd be given the power to play the blues. You'd be given the adoring women who would follow you around, and you'd be a legend. But you died at a very terribly early age. And when Johnson played, you know, he had a cataract in one of his eyes, and when the light hit it, it would glow, and people said that's the evil eye. And when he played certain passages on his guitar, he'd turn his back, and everyone thought he had something to hide, this mysterious tuning that the devil had placed on his guitar, but actually he didn't want anybody to steal his licks. And then when he drank from the open whiskey bottle that was laced with strychnine, and it took him 3 days to die, and he was on his hands and knees howling like a dog at 27, the idea of making pacts or crossing into supernatural soliciting or whatever it was became pretty famous. And to be factual, Robert Johnson at no time claimed that he sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads. And if you remember the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Right.
Pick up the blues player. His name is Tommy Johnson. And what I really like about that movie, it's very accurate because Tommy Johnson was the guy who claimed to have sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads.
You know, but which one of us has not spent a night huddled up over the toilet after way too much drinking, making a pact with whoever's willing to listen to get us through?
Whoever will listen.
That's right.
Believe me, that's it, yeah.
I will never drink again.
Yeah.
Just get me through this.
Was it Tommy Johnson or Robert Johnson who played the scale? Wasn't it Robert Johnson with Crossroads played the scale so good that people thought that there was only one way he could play these physically? Is that he either had to have broken fingers or he had to have made a pact with somebody?
Well, he had a very unique playing style, and he claimed that he'd learned to play the guitar in graveyards at night. And one of the things was that he wasn't a very good guitar player when he was younger, and the old blues guys used to dodge him. So he went looking for his real father, And I think he was gone maybe 6 months. And when he came back, he was the most incredible guitarist on the Mississippi Delta. And when they heard him play, Son House said, he sold his soul to play like that. And that's what started the whole thing with his death and the mystique. But I will tell you that when you listen to that story and you listen to Robert Johnson sing, his voice sounds almost unworldly when you listen to it. And I know that it pulled in Eric Clapton, it pulled in Jimmy Page, and it pulled in Keith Richards. So your great British guitarists were very well aware of Robert Johnson.
Well, one of those kids definitely had to have sold his soul to somebody, because I don't know how Keith Richards is still walking this mortal plane.
Well, I mean, Keith Richards is probably the poster child, for drug abuse, I guess you would say. This is what you'll look like if you survive. But, one of the things about the crossroads, it was at Clarksdale, Mississippi, where Highway 49 crosses Highway 61. And when Robert Plant and Jimmy Page did their last solo album together, the album was called Walking into Clarksdale. So it's kind of interesting about that crossroads.
That's how the Monkees got so famous. They took the last train to Clarksville. What do you think, Tim?
And that was Clarksville.
Yeah,
they were lazy
so
if they
close.
took a train.
Yeah. We have another
Clarksville, they may have lasted longer and could have learned to write their own songs.
Ouch. Hey, we've got Mike from Bloomington is on the line with us. Mike, you have a question about Jimi Hendrix?
Yes, it's interesting you talk about Robert Johnson. There seems to be kind of a parallel, and I heard that Robert Johnson at some point in time really wasn't as talented as when he started out, and then apparently he was granted some special powers. But with Jimi Hendrix, is there any connection? Because I can't think of any other pop music icon, if you will, that still has such a profound impact on electric guitar playing. And we're talking about, a guy playing Purple Haze, nothing against the Beatles, but they're singing I Want to Hold Your Hand, and I would like to know if there's any connection with the occult or the supernatural with Jimi Hendrix. I'll hang up and listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, it's a good question. When Jimi Hendrix was recording Voodoo Child, I think it was one of the guys who was in Traffic, I forgot his name, Reebok or whatever his name, he played the percussion parts. When he heard the drum parts, he was telling Jimi Hendrix that the drum parts was actually a voodoo section on drums that was summoning gods. So that was kind of, I guess we could consider that to be supernatural as far as the sound that Hendrix had with his guitar. And he's right. No one had ever played the guitar like Jimi Hendrix, and using a feedback and the sound structure he had and the effects that he used. And he died way too early and sort of left it there. And of course, it's like Rocky Marciano. When you die on top, everybody says, yeah, but what could they have ever beaten Rocky Marciano? Could there ever be a guitarist better than Hendrix? And, at Hendrix's death, he was just really depressed, and there were a lot of things going wrong, and especially he's trying to get rid of his manager. And, there's a lot of stories about he was kidnapped a few days before his death, and they had released him from the label, and he'd had drugs planted on him, and it was to show that they could reach him. And then the strange event of his death, when he had taken the overdose, and Monica Daneman, his girlfriend, calls Eric Burden before she calls the ambulance to save him. So many strange things with it, but, that's the role of pop legends. And I know that Jimi Hendrix was very well devoted to Robert Johnson and the blues, too. And if you listen to him, play Howlin' Wolf and some of the others, he was a master blues player, so he was very well familiar with the story.
Let's go. Now, before we went to break, I threw into you about the Jim Morrison thing. I thought it was interesting that Oliver Stone, who's huge into conspiracy, ended the movie The Doors with, "It is said on this day Jim Morrison died." Mm-hmm. What was it, 2 years later or 2 weeks later or whatever, his girlfriend joined him. It doesn't say, "On this day Jim Morrison died." It doesn't wrap it up like that. And I'm friends with a very popular 60s rock photographer who did a lot of really great photos with Jim Morrison and quite a few bands. And when I'd asked him one night, we'd been out drinking, and he said, "No, I know for a fact Jim's alive. As a matter of fact, in my collection of photos somewhere, I have a picture of him on his motorcycle in France 5 years after he died."
I tell you, it's the greatest urban legend of rock and roll. And it's still, people are still looking into this. And I'm pretty close to a lot of this because I do a lot of radio shows that involve that story. And I was called by another station and to come on and talk about Jim Morrison being alive and hiding in Oregon as a cowboy. And I thought, oh my gosh, you know. And I mean, to me, I mean, that's perfectly something that's completely out there. I mean, I talked to the guy, no evidence of anything. But there's some strange things. I mean,
was he going all Brokeback Mountain with Elvis?
Yeah, the Brokeback Mountain.
you complete me, man.
On the island of dead rock stars who are really alive. Or
I can't quit you.
It's just really strange. But I'll tell you what's really strange. And this just happened a few months ago because I was doing a show with Robbie and Ray, you know, Robbie Krieger and Ray Manzarek. Right. And one of the questions came up. And I'd worked with Ray on VH1 Confidential. And your listeners may be interested to know that when Jim Morrison died in 1971, Pamela Corson, his live-in girlfriend, didn't have enough money to buy the grave at Père Lachaise, so she leased it for 30 years, which meant that the lease was up in 2001, and with all the graffiti at Père Lachaise and the French never understanding American culture, what people would want to stand at Jim Morrison's grave instead of Chopin, you know? I mean, you can see signs pointing to Jim, but you never saw a sign that pointed to Fred, you know?
Right.
And anytime I go to Paris and I go to Père Lachaise, I see at least 50 people around his grave on any day I go. So he's one of the top exhibits. I think he's next to the Eiffel Tower in Paris as far as people visiting his grave, one of the sites. And I remember Ray distinctly saying on VH1 that on July 8th, 2001, he's going to be standing there with Doors fans throughout the world, and they're going to be yelling, open the box, because he didn't believe Morrison was in there. Well, we did this show, and when the question came up to me, he said, oh, that's disgusting. Jim's dead. He's been buried. And it just hit me like right between my eyes, you know, because I've never heard him say that. It's always no. I mean, it's not. So I was just really shocked. I know Robbie always thought he was dead, you know, that he died, he's buried there. Robbie's answer is, well, somebody's got to be buried there. Well, that's probably true. And I know Jim's brother-in-law, Alan Graham, and Alan has this fascinating story of a German musician whose name was Dietmar that very well resembled Morrison. And when you think about Jim Morrison with an IQ of 150 and telling the Doors that he'd like to escape this whole music thing and just become a poet or a businessman, you know, it leaves some conjecture with it. But, you know, just the idea that, you know, no one saw the body. Well, Pamela Corson saw the body. One of her friends who helped arrange for the burial saw it, maybe Mary Ann Faithfull, 3 people. And when the Doors manager came out, all he saw was a wooden coffin with the lid screwed in place. So no one actually saw it. But now the French government has agreed to let Jim stay. And the Morrison family pays for a security system in the grave, and they pay to have the graffiti cleared. And it looks like Jim's going to be the American in Paris who's going to be staying there for a long time now, probably forever.
But doesn't that lend to the whole conspiracy, too, that, you know, well, we better just keep him where he is?
Yeah, well, you know, Alan Graham told me, he said, and what would happen if they opened the grave and nobody was in it? And you got to remember that's Jim's brother-in-law.
Right.
So I really think that Jim is dead, and I think he's buried at Père Lachaise. And my own personal belief from everything I found. Last year a book came out. I was in Paris last summer, but a book came out saying that Jim had died at the Electric Circus from an overdose, and that a paramedic had came in and pronounced him dead in the bathroom.
Right.
Nightclub. And then the 2 men who gave him the drugs said, no, he's not dead, and they took him to his apartment. Now, when they put him in the bathtub, what's kind of odd is his back was against the faucets. So very few people sit in a bathtub with your back against the faucet. It's very uncomfortable.
Right.
So it was like he was planted there. And if that story's true, then Pamela Corson's story has to be untrue because she wasn't there with him. And, you know, when Pamela Corson was asked by, Danny Sugarman, if Morrison were alive, her answer was this. She said, well, if Jim were alive, he would call me. Odd, huh?
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember Ray Manzarek when Friday Night Video started in the 80s. He was like one of the first hosts of Friday Night Videos.
Right.
And I remember him just being absolutely liquored up looking and making some throwaway comment about the fact that Morrison wasn't dead. And then like a couple, week or two later on Entertainment Tonight clearing it up. And just, they kind of discounted it in like a comment that, he was just drunk and, just being reactive on the show to get people's attention.
Yeah, well, I was a little shocked because I remember I've got a copy of the DVD of him saying that. It sort of surprised me. But other than that, I mean, that's one of the great stories. So who knows? But that's what I love about the topics, is because the music will last forever. So will the stories, and they'll be known by whole new generations. And what fun people can have by going into this and listening to their music and learning something about some of the greatest artists who ever lived, and get these great stories.
Well, let's talk about, on the back of the book, you mentioned chilling quirks of fate surrounding the deaths of musicians in the Allman Brothers Band and Leonard Skinner. Skinner has always seemed to capture everybody's attention. We have about 3 minutes left on the show. Why don't you hit us with some of the highlights of that as well?
Oh, you want to talk about the Allman Brothers and Skinner?
Yeah, please.
Okay, the story of the Allman Brothers was really interesting, is that on October 29th, 1970, Duane Allman had a opium overdose in Nashville, Tennessee, and they rushed him to the hospital, and the doctor in the emergency room said, well, I'm sorry, he's just too far gone, he's not going to make it. And when he said that, Barry Oakley, the bassist and Duane's best friend, just went berserk, went out to the parking lot, fell on his knees, and started praying aloud and saying, God, just give him one more year, just one more year to live, please, just one more year. And after about 20 minutes, the doctor comes out, and he has this shocked look on his face, and he says, look, I don't know how to tell you this, but he's going to be okay. Well, Duane Allman recovered. The band continued, but on October 29th, 1971, 1 year to the date of the drug overdose, Duane Allman was killed in a motorcycle accident in Macon, Georgia.
Wow.
1 year and 13 days later, Barry Oakley was killed 200 feet from the same space in a motorcycle accident as well. So both of them were dead at the age of 24. With Leonard Skinner, they'd had bad vibes about the plane they were flying. And a lot of the members of the band were actually thinking about flying commercial. And Kathy Gaines, who was going to be killed in the plane crash, the day they left to fly to Louisiana for the next show, she told Ronnie Van Zant, she says, look, I'm afraid of this plane. I just want to ride in the equipment truck with the roadies. Just let me ride with them. And he put his arm around her and said, Kathy, honey, when your time's up, it's up, no matter where you are. So she got on the plane. But as she was getting on the plane, the other backup honkette, Joe Billingsley, who was in Arkansas, called Alan Collins. And she said, Alan, I just had this terrible dream. And I dreamed the plane crash. Please don't fly on that plane. Please just, fly commercial. But the band did fly the plane. And when it crashed, of course, Ronnie Van Zant was killed. Steve Gaines, Kathy Gaines, Dean Kilpatrick, who was their road manager, was killed as well. The rest of the band was injured. The Street Survivor album came out 3 days with the flames over Steve Gaines and Ronnie Van Zant, and they had to pull it on a black album. But the day the plane left, Leonard Skinner had fired 2 of the roadies for running up a bill in their hotels. And I think one of the roadies, I think it was Chuck Flowers, was given a gun. Ronnie Van Zant had given him a gun. And after the plane crash, he kills himself with the gun that Van Zant gave him. One of the other roadies had a tragic death. When Alan Collins got back to Jacksonville, his wife, Kathy, died from a miscarriage. Mm-hmm. And it seems like their whole life was, at the end, or Alan Collins' life was exactly like the story That Smell, about, oak trees, you're in my way. He had a car crash. His girlfriend was killed. He was a paraplegic. I mean, the whole thing was terrible. So sometimes there's a great streak of bad luck. And that's what happened with Leonard Skinner, the great story there, and the Allman Brothers. But I'll tell you, the next time I come and do your show, we'll talk about some of the great paranormal things that's not in the book, some of my new stuff that I haven't told anyone.
Great. I'd love to cover that with you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Mr. Patterson. Your stories are great. I do recommend everybody pick up the books. The Walrus was Paul, and Take a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll's Myth, Legends, and Curses. Thank you all for joining us here in the darkness on the Edge of Town Paranormal Radio Show. We'll be back again tomorrow with a brand new show. I hope that you'll join us.